So my name is Mike Wiley. I'm a VP at the New Jersey Health Foundation, which is a nonprofit foundation, and Foundation Venture Capital Group, which is an affiliated seed fund. We're an impact investor focused on a select group of affiliate partners in the state of New Jersey. So these are Stevens Institute of Technology, Rutgers University, NJIT, Rowan University, Princeton University, and one non-university, the Kessler Institute. So we only invest and fund projects that have a nexus with those institutions. And I'll get into a little bit more of our model as we go through the Q&A discussions here.
Hello, Anna Fukina. I'm with CBC Bio. We're a new fund to 50 million. We're still fundraising, almost done with the fundraising. We started investing. We invest in AgTech and computational life science platforms, seed through Series B. Usually we try to be a lead investor and try to hit about 15 to 20% ownership. Our team came out from Monsanto Growth Ventures, and we teamed up together with Data Collective, the main fund that's focused more on AI and platforms as well, but not specifically in healthcare.
Good evening, I'm Atul Varadachari, and I'm with a group called Fanon Innovation Studio. So we're, if you will, almost like a biphasic group. Our seed fund portion, or our seed investment portion, is really a combination of a seed investment, a dollar investment, and a people investment, because we believe at that early stage, those two kind of almost go hand in hand. So we contribute both the management technology as well as dollars. And then we also play a little bit later stage role for more kind of the Series A and Series B funding, whether it's for our internal projects or projects that we bring in from outside, where we will lead, and then we'll also provide the management support. We are focused almost entirely in Houston, both on Houston-based technology as well as Houston-based companies, so companies interested in relocating to Houston.
Hello everybody, I'm Pete Donnelly. I'm the Managing Director of the Accelerate New York Seed Fund. We are a bit unusual as a seed fund. Our limited partner is the state of New York. We're small and make relatively small investments, 100K maximum, in the very first stages of commercialization, typically of innovation coming out of one of the research institutions in downstate New York, and that is a geographic focus for us. Purview is pretty broad. It can be a bunch of kinds of technologies, science, engineering, IT, but we do like there to be a backbone of real innovation there. I have a second role with Stony Brook University that might help in bringing some perspective to answer questions, certainly helps inform our investing strategy. I am in that role, I'm one of the institutions spinning technologies out that wants to find investors. And I'll bring some other components of the model back with some of the discussion we'll have and some questions.
Great, thank you. And I think what's really interesting about the panel makeup, that you hear from the introductions, the organizations and funds that the panelists represent are really quite diverse. And I think just even from a paradigm perspective, the seed fund ecosystem, if you will, is very diverse. So I think one of the takeaways for the entrepreneurs and the startup companies that are in the audience is there are unique fits sometimes, and that requires a bit of due diligence on your end. But I think hopefully as we get into the Q&A session, even if you want to use some of these funds as a paradigm or drill down on some of their models via questions, that's kind of a helpful exercise to try to find that fit with maybe your unique situation. And kind of with that in mind, I'm just going to peel the onion back a little bit with some of the panelists. And maybe, Anna, I'm going to start with you on Data Collective. And it says on the website that we back entrepreneurs applying deep tech to transform giant industries. And my takeaway was that is bold, and I love it. And not every venture investor will, or maybe they'll say that on their website, but they might not do it. And so can you talk about, when you say deep tech, like what does that mean? And I'm sure there are opportunities out here, startups that say they're presenting to investors and they want a 510K that's going to go right over the transom there to FDA and its exit. Sounds like deep tech is more than that on your side.
Yeah, so I'll draw first a line between DCVC and DCVC Bio, because we are two separate funds. We work closely, but we have different investment theses. So on the DCBC Buy, we invest in deep tech and deep science. DCBC is deep tech across a lot of different industries, including healthcare, but not necessarily deep science. So they would look into diagnostic medical devices, services, and we mostly focus on therapeutics. And if we talk about therapeutics, then yes, it's a big bucks, so to speak, on the table, because very often we look into the platforms, computational platforms, that potentially can become multi-billion-dollar companies. Most of the time, I mean, we have so far have invested in 5 companies. I think 4 of them, we assume the exit will be in billions of dollars rather than 200-300 millions, which is very different than if you look into healthcare services or devices or diagnostics. But what's important for us, both DCBC and DCBC Bio, when we talk about deep tech, is the fact that we want to see clear IP around the technology. We want to know how the platforms are protected. And for us specifically, the Bio team, we want to know also, we really want to understand the science behind it. Like, does it work? Doesn't it? Again, what kind of IP you guys have? And that's very important for us.
Thanks, Anna. And Atul, I'm just going to peel the onion back a little bit on your model, or ask you to do that for me. It sounds like my understanding of the Fannin Studio is similarly, it's not even as much capital, but you're getting very involved with these opportunities, and in fact, in licensing and incubating, and maybe you could describe in your mind the difference between some of these accelerators, incubator models, and how does Fannin Studio differ for some of those?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So we come from, and I think we're based in Houston, as I mentioned, and some of what I'm going to speak to is probably more relevant in places like Houston rather than Boston, San Francisco, because we come from the perspective that in places like Houston, you don't have a lot of experienced entrepreneurs in the life sciences space. And I didn't mention when I started is we are focused almost entirely on therapeutics and medical devices. So these are the things that involve the FDA, typically involve IP, involve long cycle. And so you require people who have the deep domain expertise to actually play that entrepreneur role. And unfortunately, in Houston, there aren't too many of us. Right? And so we come from the perspective that typically, as an investor, I'm sure those of you who are as entrepreneurs here have heard that, typically investors would like to see experienced entrepreneurs. And the challenge is, until you have investors, it's hard to attract experienced entrepreneurs. And so it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. So the way we approach it in Houston is that we basically say we are both. We're both the early stage entrepreneurs, if you will, and we are also the seed investors. And that allows us to basically jumpstart that problem of the chicken and egg. And we go in and we license technology and we go ahead and develop it. In some cases, there are going to be occasions when a technology comes with an entrepreneur, and then we've done that where we bring that in, but the expectation is that at the very early stages of drug or device development, you actually don't require a dedicated management team because the science is what drives the pace of development. Again, the analogy I sometimes use is like 9 women can't have a baby in a month. If a process takes 9 months, it takes 9 months. And so that allows this kind of a pooled team, if you will, allows us to kind of work across multiple technologies and move them forward. And if we have an entrepreneur who comes and joins us, that's fine, but they also need to appreciate that in many cases, a logical role for them is to advance their technology, but to the extent that their technology is not all consuming and not at the appropriate stage, that they play a role in other technologies. But when a technology gets to the stage where it does justify a standalone management team and maybe larger amounts of outside money, we help facilitate that process as well.
Thanks, Atul. I think one of the issues that maybe take away from this panel, or just your due diligence as you're looking at investors, is to really understand where are they coming from. What is their motivation? What is their investment thesis? And it doesn't make it any easier, as I said, where I think in the seed fund ecosystem, there's this diverse population of investors that are. Sometimes you'd think it would be all financial, but ourselves, we're an impact investor. There's double bottom line, triple bottom line. There's different types of models. And so I wanted to kind of tease that out because I think it's a good representation on this panel. So maybe I'll start with Peter, because I know you probably have a slightly different focus, or at least partially different than maybe, say, Anna's fund in terms of the drivers of why you're investing in the state of New York.
Yeah, I don't think it would be different. We may have some secondary considerations, but I understand the source of your question. With the state of New York as our limited partner, companies may approach us from the standpoint of it's an easier hurdle to get past the diligence bar. That is, if you have that perspective, unfortunately not the case. Our first priority is absolutely financial return to our limited partner, who happens to be the state of New York. As part of focusing on that financial return, though, the hope is that we get to those secondary measures that are, frankly, extremely important to the state, and that is building successful companies in New York that create jobs and pay taxes. But I'll say the state, our limited partner is Empire State Development Corporation, for those of you who might know New York State. Essentially, it's the economic development agency of the state. And their writ is certainly jobs and company creation and growth and recruiting. And most of their programs go to that. With this venture program that they have been very good at recognizing it is not a jobs first program. It is a build successful companies first program, and if you do that, jobs and economic development will follow from that.
So I'm going to try to start to drill into some more specifics at this point. And I think a lot of the entrepreneurs in the room are interested in how do they get opportunities in front of all of you and people like you. And so maybe I'll start with Anna. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you? And kind of secondary question, what kind of information and what's your information uptake? Like an executive summary, slide deck?
Mm-hmm. Sure. We have, I would say, several sources of deal flow, and the biggest one is really the personal network. These are the VCs that we know, or these are the demo days that we go to and people we connect to, and those are the people that would send us some referrals, like check this company out. Or it might be also entrepreneurs, and they have some friends who also build companies in the field that's interesting for us. But in one way or another, probably 70% of the deal flow comes from personal networks. So it's people at some point we met and they stayed in touch with us and they sent us some materials. There's very small percent of funds of companies that come from professional services, be those bankers or some specialized companies that help founders to get in front of the VCs. Usually it's not perceived well if you cannot market yourself. It means something is wrong, and usually automatically you put it almost in like second tier bucket in terms of the quality of the company. And then I would say conferences, yes, but I would say it's more of a later stage. If you seed company, the best way would be to go to Accelerator and go through the demo day, and you get exposed to all these investors. And usually that's more or less targeted for a particular segment. IndieBio, for example, is a great accelerator for companies that are innovating within biospace. And I'm sure there are funds or accelerators specific in New York. There are a bunch of, obviously, in Silicon Valley, where we prefer going specifically for therapeutics or ag tech deals. And like agriculture space, it's completely different. And there's a whole set of events that we go to, and usually we come across sometimes people who are in the same fields, but most of the time those are pretty two separate industries. And in terms of the materials received, I always prefer deck versus exec summary. I mean, if anything, exec summary is better than nothing, but the more material you can send, the better for us, and we prefer seeing. Speaking of deep tech, I actually forgot to mention, because previous panel was on AI, I kind of assumed we'd talk about AI. We invest in AI-driven companies. So that's where the deep tech piece comes in. And this is where we want to see the compute piece in your company. In the deck, we want to know, okay, what's the technology, what's the platform, and explain it not in high-level words, oh, we're creating revolutionary platform that's going to change the world, but tell us exactly what you do. And the same thing applies if it's more on the science side. We want to know what are the results, what are the scientific papers you published. We want to get those if you have them, and if you can send them as well. But at least just the deck in the beginning, and everything else I think kind of follows obviously if there's interest in continuing the conversation.
Yeah, so I can build on that. Obviously, Fanon is a little bit unusual in terms of how we seed, but I think philosophically it's the same, where what we do is very similar to what I would argue almost any seed investor does, and that is trying to basically make a bet on the people who've come to us, right? I mean, end of the day, the earlier technology is, the more the bet is being made not on the technology or the data, but on the people behind it, right? And so I think to some extent, there are multiple screens that are probably not as formal, but one of those screens is, have you found a way to get a warm introduction to come to us, right? Because I think that's again a metric of, if you can't find somebody that knows us to make the pitch to us, then that's again something that we take into account. Second thing is that as you can see just from this panel, you talk to three seed investors, you basically talk to three completely different investment theses in most cases. And so part of your pitch needs to be really, have you gone in and really understood what the specific spaces, what the metrics are, or what it is that particular investor is looking at. Again, I think that's in some way a screen for, are you able to look at the data and understand what it is? Because eventually you're going to have to sell your technology, and if you haven't really understood what the buyer wants, then you're not going to be as effective in selling it. So I think that's kind of another second metric. And I think the third piece really is what else you can do to kind of validate the fact that you're going to get your, it is important to be able to share why your technology matters, and I think to Anna's point, to provide enough concrete data that says this is something you want to look at, but you don't want to overwhelm me with 50-page text, right? So that's again a critical thing, right? How well can you communicate? Enough data to provide information that, number one, the technology is something that's worth digging into further, and then secondly, to kind of that you can communicate. And finally, I would strongly encourage all of you is that, to the extent you can, and then actually in the seed investment space, there are a lot of people who will talk to you, right? This is like my daughter's currently, looking for a job. She's just coming she's just finishing college. And so my encouragement was go get as many informational interviews as you can possibly get, rather than going and trying to look for a job, right? So I think the same logic applies here. To the extent you can actually talk to and engage in folks who are potential seed investors, where you're engaging with them to get their input, you're actually more likely to translate that into a seed investment down the line, rather than going and saying, okay, I want $100,000 or I want $1 million.
Yeah, can I just add here? Absolutely agree. I think for seed companies, especially, the two things matter the most, the team and the technology. Like the idea, because very often there's no validation yet, so you just kind of, okay, this is what we want to do, this is the work we have done so far. So you do pay a lot of attention to the team specifically, and the quality and the experiences they had, and that usually says a lot as well.
So for sourcing deals, I would say Anna's got a pretty good working list there, and a tool with the specifics of their model, some other sources. Maybe I'll just add some comments on one of them, and then a source that we rely on heavily just given the focus that we have. So I do think accelerators are becoming an increasing part of how early stages is commercialized. And there are a lot of them out there now, and many of them are very good, and I think investors are relying on them more and more, almost in a continuous collaboration standpoint. And I think that's true even for experienced CEOs, frankly. Choose the accelerator that makes sense for you, and not that you have to choose an accelerator, but my point is more, Don't think that just because you are an experienced CEO, an accelerator cannot be helpful to you. Sometimes they have fantastic connections. They are very frequently our co-investors. And they can, for particular areas of development, bring really high value. Not the only way to go to market, and certainly not the only source of deals for us. The other source of deals for us is we work very closely and directly with all of the institutions in downstate New York that are throwing off the innovation and in many cases helping with the first steps of commercialization in the spin-outs. In our space, which is pre-seed as well as seed, certainly the innovation and the team are important. But maybe I'll just note for us, the team does not yet have to be fully formed. What we would look for is the CEO, or even if there is a temporary CEO and the company is being run mostly by a CSO, that we very quickly get to a common understanding of what you do not have and what you need and how those roles may change in the very near term. And if we're still interested and we don't have perfect agreement on that, what we would immediately start to concentrate on is governance of the company, and do you have a really good board structure in place where that board is empowered to take the right steps as the company moves forward. I would say that just as a statistical matter, most of the companies that we see at the pre-seed stage have not paid enough attention to governance, and by governance I mean, do you have a board with real power, or is it essentially the CEO is the owner, the CEO, and the board? And I can tell you that generally that's at least a yellow flag in terms of whether or not you can move forward with an investor.
Thanks, Peter. And I said to the speakers, if I don't pull these questions and answers out in terms of the nuggets we want to drop on the audience, just go kind of off script and do it. But just in that segment, I think there were a lot of real valuable nuggets dropped. One, in terms of the due diligence, I think maybe Atul mentioned it, obviously the investors are going to do due diligence on the startup and the entrepreneurial team, but I think it's really important for the startup and founders to do diligence on the investor, even just so it shows that you understand the alignment. And I think Atul mentioned this, but you'll separate yourself from a lot of other folks pitching if it shows that you put time into focusing in, understand their investment thesis, whether you're aligned with that. It's really going to help the entrepreneur. And also the point about the informational interview, if you will, even at this conference, approaching investors early on, and if you're educated about the approach and just say, hey, I'm not ready to raise right now, I'm going to be raising in 6 or 12 months, but we can tell you understand this market, and just get into a dialogue, get some feedback from them, and then tell them, I'm going to do milestone X, Y, and Z. And I know, most investors, if you achieve those milestones, they're going to want to hear back from you, right? Because that's a company you should pay attention to because they can execute. So I think that informational kind of interview is a great suggestion. And then, Anna talked about having kind of all this background, this detailed information that her team, because they go deep on the tech, you need to have that available, but she wants, maybe a pitch deck or something a little bit lighter up front. And I think it's interesting when you hear the different panels, and there's one even this morning where I saw, 2 investors had a difference of opinion in how on one particular topic. I think my feedback would be, it's like the biggest exam you've ever studied for. You want to be as prepared as possible, and then you have to maybe slightly alter your approach depending on the particular investor. So having, say, backup slides, or having all that information ready. So if Anna says, I love your deck, now give me X, you're ready to keep that warm introduction and keep building on that. So a lot of great information. And I think Peter's point around this governance, especially in the very earliest stages of formation, I know on our side, I think similar to probably you, Peter, have a lot of academic founders, researchers that we don't necessarily expect them to be rock stars, entrepreneurs from day one. That's not where they've trained. They're fantastic scientists. But a way to, I think, mitigate risk is to put a strong governance structure in place, or the terms around structuring the transaction, which we're going to get into. But I think for the entrepreneurs out there, don't take that as a negative. It's just a way for the investors to get comfortable and be able to say yes. They want to make sure that the appropriate controls are in place as you, the entrepreneur, get more experienced and savvy and prove, frankly, to the management team that you're capable of, taking on the management responsibilities, basically. So just to keep drilling down a little bit further, and Atul, maybe I'll start with you. What does the kind of the timing look like for an investment opportunity, and how do you typically structure deals? And do you syndicate? Do you go solo?
That's a great question, and again, I suspect that we're a little bit atypical. I think again it depends a little bit on, effectively, like I said, we're biphasic, right? So the early stage technologies, which we are basically in licensing, and we are really the management team for all practical purposes. Our process of investing or bringing it in is probably a little bit looser. We'll kind of make sure we like the technology, like the inventor. I think that's to us, that inventor is a proxy for a management team, if you will. And then while the deal is being papered, we'll actually get started working as soon as we have a handshake deal in place. So, we might have been working on something for a year before it actually gets papered, and because sometimes getting stuff done with tech transfer offices can take a while. I think the ones where we bring in, where we lead the round, but bring in other investors, that's probably a little bit more rigorous. That I think one of the things that you will hear is that if a deal is going to get done, you want momentum working on your side. And so ideally we'd like to get something done in a matter of a couple of months. It shouldn't take 6 months. But the way we would do it is that we would go in, we would lead it, we'd make sure we get everything in place. And then once we have everything in place, then we will bring in the rest of our syndicate. And we're fortunate that we have a number of other folks who come in as co-investors with us, if we've already done the diligence and we've already, if you will, underwritten the deal. But we won't even bring other folks in until such time as we know we've got a deal that we can do, and we have internal cash that we can kind of do the initial funding. But then those typically, we get the term sheet in place, typically within a couple of months of starting the conversation, with the goal of saying it takes another couple of months to get the initial deal signed, and then and then if we do tranching, then that's a little bit different. But it shouldn't stretch out over 6 to 12 months, because if you don't have momentum working for you, then I think it's a little bit harder.
Sure. We usually, I would say, spend about 4 months, 3-4 months from the date we met a company, if they're fundraising now, to the time we close the deal. Now, it's kind of an organizer and then a regular tech investor, but again, we speak more of like healthcare space where it takes more time for us, especially because we're a lead investor. We really want to spend time doing due diligence, going inside, checking out facilities. We usually meet, 20 times with a company. So we see company all the time, whether it's us going to your side or you coming to us. And there's constant interaction. It starts with just like an introduction, a deck or something like that, a call, then a meeting, then usually we come to the side, then all this material start being sharing, data room, etc., etc. But it does take about 3-4 months. I think the fastest deal we've done was few weeks, but it was because Data Collective, the main fund, has invested before, and we already were familiar somewhat with the company. But yeah, if you come to us and say, oh my God, we're closing the round tomorrow, and it's a great company, we have all these investors, all term sheets, you just gotta do it fast, we say, come back to us next round.
And just on that, when people hear that, 20 meetings in 4 months, my sense is that's not just to get basic information, but can you talk about the relationship building that goes on?
Yeah, of course. Relationship building is very important because we take a board seat, we are lead investor, and we usually help to syndicate, we usually help to bring a lot of even like if you don't have a full team, we will help you hire people. So we really get to know you well, And the companies we invest in, they usually all excited to work with us, because if you don't have that dynamic, probably it's just not a great fit. Yeah, so we dig deep in terms of understanding what exactly you do. But of course, the relationship building aspect is very important, because we're gonna be with you for many years. And we're not an investor who just puts in money and forgets, and they're like 20, we're actually very concentrated. Just because we invest very, relatively large stakes for VC funds, we're very concentrated, unlike many other VCs. So we would invest in like 5 companies per year, and we want to spend a lot of time. And operationally, we do spend probably 50% of the time with companies.
Peter, how about on your end?
So we can either lead or follow. If we lead, we typically prefer a convertible note structure, just because it's simpler and faster and avoids questions of valuation. But we're also comfortable with priced rounds if someone else is leading, or we'll join. We've done lots of those, and happy to join a syndicate where that structure already exists. On a note, we would typically, the first question from people who are familiar with notes is, do you require a valuation cap or not? Yes, we do. And if you want to get into any of the specifics of that, happy to talk to you afterwards. But I think you would generally find that's typical for pre-seed and seed investors in this space. On size of investment, while our investment is limited to $100,000, the deal size is defined by working with the company to come up with the deliverables for what comes out of the use of funds. And we like to do that in a conversation that involves potential investors in the next round, and what do they need to see in order to be highly interested, assuming the success of those experiments. And that can take, in some cases, a lot of time to fully define well. And then we'll say, where are we going to get all that work done? Who will do it? And what is the price of all that work? And then that's the size of the round that we want to raise. And it ranges from $200K to $2 million. And we probably, I guess that's a good note on timing. We're probably typical of what Atul was describing in terms of the time it takes, and I'll join Anna in saying typically if you come to us and say we need investments tomorrow, that doesn't work. And in particular, if you come to us and say we need investment tomorrow because if I'm a postdoc working on an invention coming out of the lab I was in, because my postdoc is ending, I will be very sympathetic, but not an attractive investor. And I'll also say we can sometimes be a little slow, and that can be for reasons that Anna is noting in building a relationship. Sometimes you have a team that is very well credentialed with a track record, and those are easier, although you still want to be able to establish that you have a good working relationship. And for better or for worse, a lot of the time we'll work with proxies on some of those measures. So what is your background? What have you done? Who have you worked with? Can we talk to those people and get a running start in getting that comfort level? But if the science is really interesting and we don't have those proxies available to us, it'll take some time. And we're not likely to cut those corners. So it's again, back to that first comment, while sympathetic to some urgency on your side, be aware that that urgency is typically not a good thing in motivating a potential investor in your company. Manage that urgency, and don't come to the investor panicky for, hey, I'm running out of money tomorrow.
Question?
Yeah, I have a question for the panel. There are a lot of accelerator programs and incubators that would dearly love to have their graduates secure funding from any real firms. What, if anything, do you use to discriminate amongst accelerator and incubator programs to determine whether they are a good deal flow source or just a run-of-the-mill gem?
I'll take it. I don't think we discriminate. I would say we just, my personal experience, I've gone to a lot of accelerators, and based on the companies and literally driven by data, I've gone here 2 or 3 times. How many companies were actually interesting? If it's 0, probably not going to go again. If it's 1, 2, probably I'll go again. But if they're like a lot, then it's definitely on a high list. And that I'm sure that most of the investors act the same way. There are some accelerator programs that are kind of general, and it's good to go once in a while, but if you're a very focused investor like us, where we invest in agtech and computational, specifically life science platforms, very often I come across maybe 1 or 2 companies in a batch of like 30 companies that might be a fit. But most of the time, I just know there are very specific programs or smaller events organized specifically targeted at agtech companies or companies that are life science computational platforms. And some of them we actually host ourselves because there's just not enough of those.
So I can take a cut at that too. So if you think about what we do therapeutics and medical devices. And frankly, for therapeutics, it's not very clear to me that accelerator programs add a lot of value, because the life cycle for technology development and de-risking for therapeutics tend to be a little bit longer than where an accelerator program can add a lot of value. I think it can be a little bit different for simple diagnosis. So if you think about really complex PMA type devices, that's more, the profile is more like a therapeutic, maybe not as complex, but for simpler devices, to me, where the most value that can come out of an accelerator program is one where there's a lot of focus on de-risking from a market perspective. And I think different accelerator programs have different foci, where they feel like they add support or add capabilities to their teams. And to us, the market de-risking is more valuable, for example, than things that generally make you a strong general manager or other things. So that's really what we do look for from an accelerator perspective for devices.
Yeah, we're similar, and I do think there's a difference in accelerators, certainly. But how we would try to solve that is maybe in a manner similar to Anna, who's, I think, saying she manages it with her time. If I go and I don't find anything, I'm probably not coming back. With our geographic focus, it's perhaps easier for us to get to know the accelerators in our downstate geographic focus. And we would manage it by that relationship with the folks running the accelerator who know what we're looking for and do something of a screen for us and say, look at this and this, but you don't need to look at this, all of these other things yet, still working with them. And maybe to come back to a comment that Atul made on do accelerators help with life sciences, I'll respectfully disagree. And maybe this is part of what I mean by accelerators are becoming a bigger part of the landscape. JLabs recently came to New York City, and they, I think, are in now 8 cities around the world. And while I do think historically, accelerators in life sciences have not been as important in advancing companies. I think you can look at JLabs as a good example of what a lot of accelerators in life sciences are doing, and in my opinion, they're bringing very high value, if for no other reason than the relationships that they bring. And I don't mean relationships just with J&J, although I certainly wouldn't skip a relationship with J&J. They are conveners in the community. If you go to a JLabs event, you're going to see who's working in the community and the ecosystem in downstate New York. And that could be a CSO that you are looking to hire that you cross paths with. It could be an investor. It could be service providers like law firms or others. But it can also just be meeting other CEOs in your space, and the energy that comes out of that community is a healthy thing.
And just if I may respond, I don't disagree at all with what you said, Peter, but we have J Labs in Houston too, but I guess from my perspective, that's kind of more of an incubator kind of. So when I said accelerators for the therapeutics, I'm thinking about those defined programs where you come in, you get basically coaching and some introductions, and then you leave. But I completely agree with.
No, I'm with you, and I think an important point here is accelerators and incubators are trendy terms right now, and there are a lot of them. But I think what each does can vary a lot, and some of them bring more value in a particular area with programmatic work. Some offer a better deal as a real estate operation, frankly, if you need wet lab space or a hot desk. So yeah, there can be a big difference in what people mean by accelerator.
So I just have a question on same topic. I love this. So there is a bottleneck when it gets to accelerators and incubators, and that is getting to them. So qualifying for them, being prepared to move into them, takes some work. You don't just say, I think I'm just gonna join you. You get selected. So what's your thoughts on the way all the companies or even startups prepare to even go to an accelerator or startup? And do you actually take these companies directly yourselves, or how much do you rely on accelerators? So what are the pathways to get to the seed? No.
I would say not necessarily too unlike coming to an investor, but maybe you can be a little more open in sharing some of your warts and areas for development and applying for an accelerator. That's part of what they will help you with. But I think it still fundamentally comes down to what is your value proposition and what is the probability that you can deliver on that value proposition.
Does it make more attractive going through an accelerator?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But with a distinction on what accelerator and what they brought specifically.
Right, and I think to some extent, just like with investors, accelerators also have different, if you will, needs or different preferences. So I think before you spend a lot of time trying to apply for an accelerator, talk with them to find out what exactly they're looking for.
Do you get direct, though, do you accept direct opportunities without accelerators?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Most of ours are.
Most of them are. Yeah, I was wondering what's the percentage? Which?
Yeah, a lot of the companies go through accelerator. I came across some companies that have gone through 3 or 4 accelerators and funded themselves through that initially, and then started raising Series A. Yeah, that's also a possibility.
Right, and again, just to build on that, right, tech, software, I think those are things where the traditional accelerator program actually adds greater value because you can actually get a lot done in that period of time. I think the more complex things, I think something like a J Labs, where you have a broader ecosystem, can actually probably add more value than a traditional accelerator program.
Yeah, but, sorry, finish that. But I wanted to say that you should think about it as what is it that they can give you, rather than, oh, check mark, I have an accelerator and therefore I'm gonna have more demand from investors. Because sure, statistically, a lot of the companies we invest have gone through accelerator, but if I talk to them and they say something that completely doesn't make sense or is not interesting, I don't care whether you've gone through YC or anything else.
Just to underscore both of those points, I mean, I think I'm with a tool where you're talking about, biotech or PMA, med device, how many accelerators can really hang in there that long to develop that technology. And at the same time, Anna's point, I think it's similar to the due diligence we talked about before on a VC. I mean, really do your homework, because any of these accelerators, they're going to take something. And so you want to make sure you're getting value out of that. And that's an investor you're going to have to manage in your cap table. And I've heard, we work with students a lot, I've heard students talk about it from that perspective, like, oh, I need to get this box checked, and I'm gonna go for this vanity, accelerator program, and in some cases, that could be a really good fit, and they should go after that and apply, because there's some very strong programs where the tech aligns very well. But if it doesn't align well and you're just looking to check the box, that might not be the best answer.
Yeah, I would echo that, and maybe part of what your question is, should I wait until I get into an accelerator? And I would say no. You've got the job of CEO and bringing the company forward one way or the other, and I would say come to us directly as you are looking for accelerators that might be appropriate. And I echo the, hey, not all accelerators and not at all costs. Some of them have a pretty significant ask for sometimes a relatively small amount of money, at least initially. And you should weigh that. I'll say if you have a realistic idea of what your valuation is, not if you have an unrealistic idea of what your valuation is, and you can't go to somebody who you're asking for an investment or inviting to invest in your company to answer that question. We will give you our answer, but we're obviously in something of a negotiation at that point. Go to trusted advisors who are well informed to get to a very comfortable position on what your valuation is if you are doing a priced round.
Yeah, so sort of to Anna and Atul, you both mentioned earlier kind of how you look negatively on leads that come through, intermediaries like a bank or some kind of a broker service or things like that. And I mean, I definitely see the logic in that. My only question would be that for kind of these very early stage and especially kind of bio, sort of therapeutic things that are truly coming out of a clinic type setting, where you have people that you discussed earlier that are their job, they're a clinician, they're a researcher, they have don't necessarily have skills in running a company, marketing, investing, fundraising. So what is it about, I mean, one could make an argument, I'm not even saying I agree with this position, but one could make an argument that there's a natural need for that intermediary to kind of fill that skill set of the PI who's good at discovering some technology, but that's kind of where their skill set ends. So why do you look negatively on intermediate leads that come through intermediaries?
So let me jump in first, and then I'll let Honor respond. I actually did not say that. I mean, I think if you have an intermediary, that's fine. But I think to the broader question, I think I'd like to see if you found a way to get a warm introduction.
Okay.
If that's through a broker, that's not the way I would necessarily go. But I think even if you're a PI and you're a clinician, then if you don't have the time and ability to go find a way to get to me, then you shouldn't be the CEO of the company, is what I would argue.
Yeah, I think twofold. One is, I have not seen a lot of companies come to us through services like that, but all of the companies that I've seen, they were just not something we would invest. Whether it's just for technology or it's out of scope, but it just, I don't think we have invested in anything actually that came through that lead. So it's more backed by kind of experience.
Yeah.
And number two, I mean, if you run a company, you need to figure out how to get into Atul's point. Like, you need to figure out how to at least get attention from investors, right? And sometimes we come across teams that are more, like a bunch of PhD students have a great idea, and we may help them find the right team. And it's fine, you should just come to us. The time is up. But the point is, I think if there is a really great idea, you should still go to an investor, and there are some investors who will help you build the right team.
Yeah.
And if not, then it's more of a project, and it might be more of like corporate strategic type of thing that people want to invest or buy rather than a startup company that you want to build.
I make one other quick comment on that, because we rarely have worked with brokers or intermediaries, and I would say the biggest distinction for me is if I get something that's clearly a high volume mass market thing with a fast follow-up, I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that. If I see a thoughtful, well-informed approach, happy to engage.
I think that's it for time, but if you have additional questions, the panelists will be here, we can take some after the session, right?
Thank you.